Good morning, and thank you for joining us. It's always a hard act to follow the Clark Kent of Great Hearts, Dan Scoggin, but we're going to do our best. And I'm delighted to have with us this morning three of the leading minds of K-12 education commentary nationally who have been good enough to join us here in Phoenix. In the case of Robert, he's been here almost a week. I think Lindsey and Jay are more recently arrived, but it is a great privilege to have the benefit of their insights this morning. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists discussing recent changes to school choice policy and also the classical moment we find ourselves in. To my immediate left is Lindsey Burke, Dr. Lindsey Burke, who is with the Heritage Foundation and oversees research on policy pertaining to preschool K-12 and higher education reform. She is a frequent guest on radio and television shows and speaks on education reform issues across the country and internationally, and she's very well published in both academic and mainstream outlets. And she's particularly knowledgeable about ESAs, education savings accounts, an issue that is of obvious import to us here in Arizona, but increasingly so across the country. And in 2021, Lindsey was asked to join Governor Glenn Youngkin's transition team in Virginia, and she has since been involved in helping shepherd K-12 education policy in that state. She's also a member of the Board of Visitors of George Mason University, which is actually her alma mater and where she earned her PhD. To Lindsey's left is J.P. Greene, also at the Heritage Foundation. He currently researches the effects of education on character formation and civic values, so he is highly qualified to weigh in on issues pertaining to classical education especially. But he has a long and varied research history, having earned his PhD at Harvard University and then subsequently being a leading member of the University of Arkansas's School of Education Reform, if I'm not mistitling that, but a very interesting institute that's been a good friend of Great Hearts in classical education over the years. And he, too, is widely published, often appears on a lot of national media outlets, commenting across the gamut of K-12 education reform. Robert Pondiscio joins us from the American Enterprise Institute, but before becoming a journalist and commentator on education policy, he actually cut his teeth in the ed world as a 5th grade teacher in a struggling South Bronx primary school. And prior to that was in media for around 20 years, including senior positions at Time and Business Week. And he's the author of a wonderful book that I highly recommend called How the Other Half Learns. It's about Success Academy, a very compelling and successful charter school network in New York City. How the Other Half Learns, Equality, Excellence, and the Battle Over School Choice, which came out in 2019. So I commend that to you if you are looking for some divergent reading. Before we begin, I also should acknowledge our sponsor this morning, Mises Graduate Institute. I hope they feel they've spent their money wisely. And we will get started. To our audience, who I hope swells over the course of the morning, I think we are slated for 45 minutes, but our panelists have been generous to let us know that if there are questions that stretch beyond that, they're very happy to stick around and answer them. So don't feel rushed. Dig in. I know there are some people who are highly expert and interested in education policy in the room, so by all means get your questions in. So I thought we would begin, as we're in Arizona, I think to quote Robert recently, he said, declared it to be the most interesting school choice state in the nation. So it seems only appropriate that we begin with an examination of this recent surge in school choice legislation, primarily education savings accounts and vouchers. We've seen legislation here in Arizona universalizing access to ESAs last year, but now there are plenty of other states following suit. So I want to ask, and I'll start with you, Lindsey, as you're an absolute expert on this. Why are we seeing this surge in ESA legislation? It's not a new idea. Milton Friedman, first sort of popularized the idea of education vouchers, in the 1970s. It's come up repeatedly since. So why, all of a sudden, in the last sort of 2 or 3 years, are we seeing universal ESAs passing across the country.
Yeah, well, thank you, Helen, and thanks to Great Hearts for having us here today, and thanks everybody for joining. Really excited to be here to talk about this because you're right, while it's not a new idea, and I have said this probably 20 times over the past 2 weeks, it is incredible the speed at which we are now seeing ESAs take hold in the states. So the trajectory that we're on, this is what's new. The fact that we are seeing a policy issue that is relatively new, right? 2011 here in Arizona, we have the first state formally adopt education savings accounts. That wasn't that long ago, right? Just over a decade ago. And to now be at the point where, depending on how you count it, we have 10 states that have some form of something that looks like an education savings account, 4 of which, by the way, are fully universal, available to every single child in the state. That is dramatic expansion of a relatively young policy idea. And you're right, this goes back to Friedman. If you go all the way back to 1955 when he first wrote his very famous essay now, The Role of Government in Education, and outlined the idea for the first time of school vouchers, of separating the financing of education from the delivery of services. I think it really remained just that sort of academic idea for decades until we started to see it take hold in the 1990s, first in Wisconsin and then slowly throughout the 90s. And then it wasn't until 2011 where we saw Arizona really take that initial idea and develop it and refine it. And the reason they were able to refine it into ESAs also goes back to Friedman. Friedman gave an interview, I think it was 2006, in the journal Education Next. Pearl Rock Kane was the lady who interviewed him. And he said in that interview, look, school vouchers are great, but why should you have to use all of your voucher at one particular school? Why not spend part of your voucher maybe on a French class at one school and part of your voucher on math at another? Why not have partial vouchers? And so it was in that interview that he came up with this notion of partial vouchers. And in Arizona, the Goldwater Institute ran with that, took that notion of partial vouchers, and ultimately turned it into the policy that became ESAs, which are, in effect, partial vouchers. And so, hence, we see in 2011, they become the first state to do it. And, I don't know if Matt Ladner's in the room, but if he were here, he would be quick to say, they were building the plane as they were flying it. But I think they built a beautiful, I don't know, what's the best airplane out there? 747 Concorde, they don't fly anymore. But they built there you go, a beautiful, beautiful private jet. And that it has worked great for families. I think they hit the ball out of the park immediately when it comes to things like accountability. We can talk more about that. But I think we're seeing the rapid growth because for 3 reasons. One, I'll steal something that Jay said the other day. Public schools have really broken faith with families, and they've done that in a few ways. We saw it through COVID, where they literally shut their doors to kids who had no other options. Then when, of course, and it's cliche to point it out at this point, but when parents saw what their kids were actually being taught, that they were being taught radical gender ideology, critical race theory, and everything in between, they were supremely unhappy about that and wanted some option. So I think there's that breaking of faith, but I also think we've seen this rapid explosion of ESAs because other states are looking around and saying, hey, the water's warm, we can do this. Arizona did it. The world hasn't imploded. In fact, there's still 1.1 million kids in Arizona public schools and public charter schools. And I also think it's the competitive pressure. We release an annual now Education Freedom Report Card at Heritage where we rank states on many education issues, but education choice is chief among them. You get extra points for a good ESA program. And we routinely get state legislators calling us, governors calling us, saying, what can we do? We want to improve our ranking. And so I think it's those 3 components in particular that schools have broken faith with families, that there's that competitive pressure out there, and that legislators are able to look around and say, hey, this is something that is tenable, families like it, and we have the political will to do it.
Thank you, Lindsey. Jay, is there anything you'd add to that comprehensive answer?
Sure, thanks. Look, I think that in addition to this policy innovation of ESAs, there's also been a political change in the reform movement, which is an important part of why we're seeing this success. So, look, I've been involved in the school choice movement for 3 decades now, which means I'm old. We tried a lot of different arguments for school choice, and they were good and true arguments, but they really didn't work. and we were overly slow to learn what kinds of arguments for choice were effective politically and which kind were not. We were way too slow. The arguments we tried out early on were that choice, the first one was choice is good because it promotes competition, and competition leads to improved outcomes, greater efficiency. It's true, but as it turns out, it's not politically very appealing. A lot of families are suspicious of markets with reason, and so they're not easily persuaded to buy an abstraction like choice and competition or markets. We also tried for a long time an equity and social justice argument, where we said, look, the reason why we need to expand school choice is because some people have access to quality options, but other people, particularly minority families and urban centers, are lacking in quality options, and everyone should have access to those options as a matter of equity or social justice. Again, it's a good and true argument, but it politically was not very effective because targeting our programs and our efforts exclusively or predominantly on low-income minority populations in urban centers greatly limited our political appeal. As it turns out, urban minorities are a relatively small portion of the total population, and they're also not particularly well suited on average to advocate effectively given their disadvantage. The fact that they're disadvantaged educationally also makes them disadvantaged politically, and so they're less well positioned to win in political battles and protect those programs even if they can be adopted. And so we hit ourselves again, our heads against the wall for 3 decades, so that 2 years ago, we had fewer than 1% of all students in private school choice programs subsidized by the state in the entire United States. So 3 decades of effort and less than 1% of students signed up, okay? That really was a failure. And it was a failure that we weren't willing to acknowledge and learn from and adapt. Well, the pandemic, not only did it break faith with families, where schools broke faith with families during the pandemic by failing to be open for service, and also revealing sometimes radical content that parents didn't like, that didn't align with their values. But when those schools broke faith with families and that was revealed, some within the education reform movement saw the opportunity to offer a new argument. And the new argument is that we need to expand school choice so that we can help families raise their own children with values and preferences that align with what they're trying to do at home. And that argument works really well, as it turns out. We capitalized on this upset that parents have legitimately had, and we have successfully pushed through school choice. So as Lindsey just said, we now have 4 states, in 2 years now, we have 4 states with universal ESAs, and by the end of this legislative session, it's possible we'll have 12. I think, my over-under is on 8, but we could have 12, and that's incredible. So I think that's the key is that the reform movement itself has learned from the pandemic. And particularly want to give shouts out to Tommy Schultz at American Federation for Children. I think his leadership has been spectacular. Lindsey Burke at Heritage, the greatest boss I've ever had.
Thanks. Shout out to Jay Greene, and shout out to Jason Bedrick in the audience too.
Yeah, I mean, and our friends at AEI, Robert Pondiscio, Rick Hess. I mean, these are the people who have recognized that while the market argument and the justice argument were good and true arguments, that there's another argument, which is empowering families to raise their own children with their own values.
Sure. Not a lot to add on to my colleagues who kind of covered the waterfront, but just I'll amplify with a little bit of context. I don't think I'm wrong about this. I've been in education for 20 years, and it's a bit of a bromide, right? For decades, we have known that Americans hold public education in low regard, but they hold their school and their child's teacher, their child's school and teacher in high regard. That's in play now in a way that just has not existed in my time, and maybe even in my lifetime. it's still solid, right? In other words, if you look at the data, we still tend to trust, our Americans at large tend to trust their local school, their local teacher, but the absolute numbers of people who give their school, their teacher an A or a B is just simply lower than it's ever been. The one element that I would kind of throw out there that I think colors this, I mean, Lindsey, you mentioned a lot of them, the disruption, quarantines, masks, anti-masks, critical race theory, the stuff coming into Zoom school on my kitchen. I mean, I've said for years, I've lamented how incurious we are about what kids do all day in the classroom. Well, we don't need to be incurious anymore. We've seen it. We've all seen it, right? And in some cases it was a good reflection on teachers, in a lot of cases it was not. But the one other element I would throw out, and frankly, this is on us as ed reformers, we kind of broke it, right? In other words, the technocrats, as it were, just kind of ran schools for a long time. And the goal was to make, through education policy, to make bad schools more like good schools. Well, I think we did the opposite. We made good schools look more like bad schools, narrowing the curriculum, reducing reading instruction to this, tedious regimen of skills and strategies. It just doesn't work. And I think, so in other words, you don't have to be an angry culture warrior. You don't have to be, deeply upset about family values. Those are good and legitimate topics. You could just think, I just want more. This is just not that interesting, right? So I think this choice moment, I'm going to ride my own hobby horse on this. I've always made the argument to my choice colleagues, let's not talk about test scores as much. Parents don't care about test scores. They care about what their kids are doing all day. In other words, to me, the argument is not, and should not be, hey kid, or hey mom, your school sucks, forgive my language, you should demand a voucher. It should be, hey look, your school's fine. Would you like a classical school? Would you like a project-based learning school? Would you like a Montessori school? So these devices, the ESAs, what I'm excited about is it opens up the potential for a full flowering of what schools can be. I'm not saying that reading scores don't matter, et cetera. They do, but we have not been talking about the richness of what policy can create and the market, as it were, that can drive. In terms of, boy, there's just so much out there, and classical education is a perfect example of this. I simply can't think of a classical charter school that has opened anywhere that didn't have a waiting list practically the next day. Parents may not even know why they want this, but they know they want something more than they're getting.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Jay and Lindsey, for setting this up so wonderfully for a further discussion of this. And you perfectly anticipated, Robert, my next question, which is, having seen this swath of legislation pass, and Jay, I'm going to draw you out on which of the 8 states you think are likely to pass bills successfully this session in just a moment. But is it enough simply to pass the bill? Or are there other mechanisms or features or details that need to be in place to ensure that, having liberated parent demand, there is this flourishing supply side response? The ESA amount on average in Arizona is around $7,000 per student. Is that enough to bring forth this, 1,000 flowers to bloom, to echo what you said earlier, Robert? Or is that just the kind of the thin end of the wedge and we hope to ratchet up from there? So I'm going to start with you, Jay. How can we expect the market to evolve in these states that have universalized ESAs, and how quickly is it likely to change, and in what ways?
So it's an excellent question, and I think the answer is slowly. These things don't happen overnight, and this is going to take a lot of work. Simply passing the bill is not enough. We do have to work on creating a quality supply of schools, staffed with quality people, and that's going to take a lot of work on a lot of different people's part. We do have a huge problem with our ed schools, that they're not particularly well preparing people for this new landscape, especially with quality instruction in classical settings. And so it's not that classical schools don't have quality staff, they do, but they're having to develop them themselves, and it would be nice if there was a pipeline that helped feed into them better. As to the dollar amount question, I would just say that, of course, everyone always likes more, but actually I don't mind having the amounts be modest. First, I think the cost savings are going to be part of the appeal that will help this grow. There are cost savings here, by the way. The other thing is that I think families need to be financially invested in their children's education. And so the fact that families sometimes will find themselves wanting to supplement with their own resources is a good thing. That's a feature, not a bug, because it means that the families are financially invested. And even very low-income families can make contributions financially to their own children's education, just like they can buy food for their own children and clothing for their own children. We want families to feel like they're part of raising their children and not simply the recipients of a welfare benefit from others. There's an important principle in Jewish tradition where even the poor are required to give charity. Because that's just part of being a person with dignity, is that you're not just a recipient, you're a contributor too.
And before I throw to Lindsey, the 8 states.
So Arkansas just passed its universal ESA bill through its Senate yesterday. It's up now in the House. So I think they may be next in line. Perhaps within a week we might see universal ESAs in Arkansas, making it the 5th state. Oklahoma, I think, has a very good shot. Texas.
Florida is more likely.
Florida. Then some of the outside ones, Idaho, Wyoming, Montana. So that's how you can get to a dozen. But right, I think.
Hey, those are all red states.
Well, I mean, look, this is part of the problem with the Ed Reform movement. I think an excellent point, by the way, on its technocratic nature. So there began to be a mindset among Ed Reformers that the problem is that schools were run by bad, dumb people who were in the teachers' unions, and what we needed to do was to displace them with good, smart people like ourselves. But it was still the same top-down system. It was just a question of who was the boss. And I think that was a mistake. But it was also a problem that we went, there was a capture by the left of the education reform movement. And our obsession with urban minority populations made us neglect the easier victories that might be obtained in red states.
Well, if I can jump, just as a point of order, the obsession with urban populations was what made the bipartisan ed reform movement happen. That was the thing we could coalesce around, right? In other words, that was the common ground for both left and right, and it lasted for about a decade.
Well, but it was a myth. It actually never happened. This is the greatest myth in ed reform. And I was part of the myth. I mean, it was something that we hoped. You know how sometimes you say something because you hope it will be true, not because it is true. And we hoped it would be true, that we could form a bipartisan coalition of urban minority elected Dems with ideologically committed elected Republicans. And the claim is that happened in Milwaukee. It did not. Anyone who actually wants to know the story of Milwaukee, that's not what happened there. It never happened really anywhere, pretty much. And so the private school choice movement for its entire history has basically been a Republican-led movement.
You did the analysis.
We looked at it empirically. I mean, Democrats have never made a difference pretty much, other than in Louisiana with a horrible school choice bill, the Democrats have basically never made a difference in passing private school choice legislation.
Can I go just out of order, just because I can build on this point? You alluded to this, Helen, but my background as a teacher, I spent 5 years teaching at a poor performing school in the South Bronx, and then on and off several years after that in a charter school in Harlem. So what led me into this work was concern for disadvantaged kids. Okay, with that as a backdrop, one of the reasons I'm here in Arizona this week is to meet with folks who are to ask this question: hey, what are the ESAs going to do to the opportunities that exist? Candidly, I'm most interested, and I'm not saying this just because you're sitting here, Helen, but what really interests me is are we going to see things like Great Hearts Christos? Because ESAs are probably not an answer for the population of students that I've spent my entire career focused on? Well, Great Hearts Christos might be. So the question that I have is do ESAs in these states create a policy environment where to create a flowering of low cost or at least affordable private schools that can soak up all those ESA dollars? Because as a practical matter, the families that I've worked with, they are never going to bespoke their education. They're not going to, what did you call it, the mini voucher, Lindsey? Partial voucher. They need to send their kids to a school every day. Period, full stop. So, I mean, I guess I shouldn't tell stories out of school, but I spent an hour last night after dinner trying to talk Catherine Burbelsing into bringing Michaela to Arizona. It's like, this is the time, Ms. Snuffy. You could do this. I'm not going to let go of that. I think it would be a great thing to bring Michaela here to the U.S. But that would be an answer as well. In other words, who are the quality operators who have a good track record running schools, especially schools that are successful with high poverty populations? That's the kind of thing I'm hoping we're going to start to see a full burgeoning of.
How optimistic should we be, Lindsey, and how can we kind of stack the deck a little to bring forth some of what Robert's just canvassed?
Well, and I think Jason can correct me on the numbers if I'm wrong, but I think the median private school tuition in Arizona is below the average ESA amount. So, when we're talking about is the ESA at roughly, $65,000, $7,000 as a base per pupil allocation sufficient for a good, robust supply side response? I think it is. And then if you consider the fact that, again, I think Arizona really did a great job in designing their program right out of the gate. These ESAs are weighted, right? If you are a student with special needs, you get closer to, I think the median was 14,400 in our most recent data that we have. And so I think the money's certainly there, and I concur with Jay 100% that, we want these to be, is part of the feature of an ESA is that there is some cost savings that's realized. But what is exciting to me is the sort of piecemeal approach. And I know not everybody, not a majority, not a small, number probably will even take up the ability to do a completely piecemeal, not set foot in a brick and mortar school, do-it-yourself education. But there will be some. We looked a few years ago in Arizona at how families were spending their ESA dollars and where they were enrolling, and about a third of families did just that. They didn't enter a brick and mortar school at all. They used their ESA to purchase curricula, buy textbooks, maybe contract with a private tutor, maybe do an online course. So they were schooling at home effectively with an ESA. And so right out of the gate, to have about a third of families doing that was non-trivial. We replicated that in Florida, looked at how ESA families in Florida were doing, and we saw numbers that were similar, actually slightly higher. I think we were closer to 44% of families in Florida who were totally customizing their children's education. And so that's what gets me excited about it, is just the idea of being able to really do a completely tailored education. I would be curious, though, Robert, to get your take. I think a lot about what Robert talks about with regard to the teaching profession as a whole, that we have, 3 million teachers. What do you say? More than the combined number of doctors and lawyers out there. And so, if we ever do get to a point, and we will one day, where we have completely universal education choice across the country, I am optimistic and confident, it might be 25 years from now, that we will get there, where every single child is funded from day one with an ESA, rather than being assigned to a government-run school and hoping to have some choice. So if we do get to that point where every single child's funded with an ESA, what does that mean for the teaching workforce? Presumably a large chunk of that 3 million will end up having to shift over to a private market. And so, I'm sorry, I'm asking.
I'm redundant at this point, because that was my next question. So please go ahead.
Well, interesting you should say. I've done hundreds of school observations in my career. Tuesday or Wednesday was the first time I'd ever done one over someone's dining room table. So what you're seeing here in Arizona are microschools, Prenda in particular. But what ESAs allow you to do, and the funding mechanisms are quite complicated, is to open a microschool at public expense, so not homeschooling. It's a microschool where you might have 6 or 8 kids, and that teacher, oh, wait a minute, did I say teacher? It's not a teacher, it's a guide. Absolutely not a teacher. The teacher of record is an online charter school. The person delivering the lesson, the air quotes teacher, is not a teacher as we understand it right now. That cuts both ways, right? That highly democratizes the process. Look, I mean, at the risk of saying or speaking heresy, I think there's a lot. On the one hand, I worry that we've spent 30 years in education reform thinking we're going to make teachers better, and my firm opinion on this is you're probably not. You have to make the job easier. But I can see a way forward that through things like microschools, as long as there is a curriculum that they can follow, and there is a way that we make it easier for folks to kind of pay students, assess, etc. I'm not saying the job is easy, but it's easier than Teacher Inc. wants us to think. So I'm really interested to see if we kind of make this more of a if we demystify teaching through mechanisms like microschools. The other thing that's interesting, Arizona is so different. Teachers just sound different in this state. I've noticed this all week. We haven't talked at all about open enrollment in Arizona, but this is one of the reasons, Helen, why I said this is the most interesting and robust choice state is because of that. There's been open enrollment in Arizona since 1994. I knew that. What I didn't know was that every 50% of Arizona kids are in a school or a setting other than the one that they would be normally based on their zip code. So that's already had competitive effects. When I say that teachers sound different, educators are simply used to the idea that I have to serve a customer, so to speak, that I'm in competition with other districts. That changes the dynamic as well. I'm not as sanguine as you are about that 25-year time horizon. I think I'd put the over-under closer to 50 at universal choice, but for the first time in my career, Lindsey, I think we are going to get there.
Given that, I think we can all anticipate as well that with the advances of school choice and the universalization of ESAs, the clamor for accountability for the expenditure of public dollars is sure to follow. So I want to ask you, Jay, because I think you may have the most kind of piquant response to this, whether certain accountability may be subject to state testing or so on is a reasonable quid pro quo for the use of public dollars, or if not, how does the school choice movement go about formulating a successful set of arguments to resist that incursion?
So I think it's important to really fight back on the likely effort to overregulate. I mean, as we are rapidly expanding universal ESAs, and whether it's 25 to 50 years, I do think we're approaching escape velocity where it will be universal everywhere in the country. But the empire will strike back. It doesn't go away. This war is never won. It's just the front line moves. That's all. And the new front line will be regulation, and they'll try to strangle this with regulation. So we really need to push back. Now, I can give you a substantive answer on what accountability is required when using public dollars, and I think actually the answer, as a matter of principle, is actually very low. So, for example, we provide senior citizens with Social Security, and we require no accounting for the use of those funds. It's intended to prevent destitution in people's later years, but we don't require that they certify that this is true. We don't require that they certify that the money is used for food and housing and not at the casino. We don't demand an accounting of the resources. What we can think of ESAs, I think, properly as is resources to families to help them raise their children. And obviously, I think we have laws about abuse and neglect where families are failing to raise their children, and in which case the state does intervene, and there are criteria for what constitutes abuse and neglect. But short of that, I think there ought to be a lot of leeway in how we empower families to raise their children. And we ought to be thinking, in principle, more of these resources more like Social Security. Now, as a practical matter, we are going to have more regulations than that. And we should just try to get as little as we can. So, for example, the bill in Arkansas requires testing, but it doesn't say that you have to use the state test. You can use a wide variety of tests. That's also the case in Arizona. And this, Why do we need this requirement at all? I don't know. But if we must have the requirement, let's try to make it, you know, a less burdensome requirement, like choose your test, as opposed to mandate the state test, which then drives a particular curriculum and a particular kind of pedagogy.
Lindsey, I'm going to invite you to jump in at this point and then throw to Robert, who wrote about this very thing only yesterday, I believe. Yeah.
Oh, wow. Well, you know, I think we've all heard, but it's the question of accountability for what and to whom. And I do think that that is still the proper framing for how we think about regulations when it comes to ESA programs in particular. You know, we do need strong transparency around taxpayer dollars, although when you say public money, I'm certainly more of the Margaret Thatcher, there's no such thing as public money. Just put that on the table, but it's your money and my money. But look, public dollars, right? We need strong transparency around how those are spent. And again, I think Arizona did a pretty bang up job on this particular aspect of the ESA, right? Where if you are in the ESA option, you're sending receipts quarterly to the state. The state is verifying that you have not made any accidental misexpenditures or anything worse. In the event there is some misexpenditure, they withhold the subsequent quarter's distribution to rectify the prior quarter's misuse. And so there's good oversight. If there's some sort of egregious misexpenditure, you can get audited, you can go to jail. So there are strong taxpayer protections, and I think that's appropriate. But when it comes to accountability for academic outcomes, I think, again, they did the right thing. They said, look, we trust parents. Parents have their child's best interest in mind, and we will require parents to effectively just sign a contract and say that they will get their child educated in the core subjects, and they can take it from there. I think that was the right balance. I hope other states, as they are adopting and implementing their own ESA options, go closer to the Arizona model and most of the models that are out there so far do have very light regulatory fingerprints, and that's going to be so important for these programs to flourish moving forward. I had another thought on something Jay said, and now I'm blanking. So the Social Security thing. I think also just in terms of access, right? We want to model Social Security and that it is available to everybody. And this is, as we're seeing ESAs, as states adopt ESA programs, that is part of the secret sauce to success, is that as they're becoming universal, you're getting more and more political buy-in, and that accrues to the benefit of the long-term stability politically of these programs.
Robert, you have any dissenting or qualifying comments to make on this?
No. Well, a couple of things. One of the occupational hazards of those of us who spend our day in think tank world is it's really, really easy to come up with airtight, compelling arguments for something. The problem is they have to win. You know, they have to be sellable arguments that are persuasive to ordinary people. This is not to say that you didn't just do.
We are winning.
Okay. Well, yeah. I'm transitioning from being less worried about the availability of choice than to maintain the political viability of choice. In other words, this has to work. Okay. It's great that we can't be the dog that caught the car. Okay. Now we have to drive the car. Just as a side note. I'm not a test pusher, I'm not a testing hawk, but neither am I somebody who wants to eliminate it. Am I wrong to suggest that ESA parents are probably going to blow the doors off testing? In other words, this would be a good, I'm not suggesting that we should have testing, but man, if you're talking about parents who are active, engaged, putting together that bespoke education, those kids are going to kill standardized tests, okay? So before you throw that away, this could be a good policy argument for you. Helen, you alluded to the piece I wrote yesterday. I'll try this argument out on this audience as well. Don't think of ESAs as a new form of funding. Think of them as a new form of accountability. The school that I worked at was terrible, frankly. You know, 10% of the kids reading on grade level. In other words, you could interpret that as we made really bad instructional decisions for children. Okay, when a school, every day you can find another story about, you know, there were 50 schools in Chicago where nobody's reading on grade level, 30 schools in Baltimore. Well, those are accountability failures. If an ESA family spends their money badly, you've limited the damage to one household. You know, as opposed to when professional educators make a bad decision, the damage is spread over hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of households. So maybe the argument, and I'm not sure this is a persuasive argument, but maybe the argument is ESAs are the accountability measure. Okay, there's that. And Jay, I just want to push back on one thing about why is this different? You know, why is this not the same as Social Security or Section 8 housing vouchers or whatnot? A pragmatic, real-world argument. We have a cultural habit of schooling in this country, and we just do. In other words, when you say public school, that conjures up a set of associations. That means it's my neighborhood school, it's where my kid goes with all the other schools. Everything else is not that. And look, I don't agree with that. To me, the reason we socialize the cost of public education is because we have an investment in every child's outcome. So ESAs are actually not, I said this in this piece, it's not, their money. You're not giving parents control of their money. You're giving them control of our money, all of our money, and we're making a bet that they will be more accountable with it, and I think it's a fair bet. But the reason I don't think those, even though I agree with those comparisons, the reason I don't think that they work is because this is what's going to take 50 years, Lindsey, to change Americans' ideas about what is and is not public education. Right now, public education is my neighborhood school. Everything else is something else, and it's going to take a long time to overcome that cultural association.
I mean, it's a good thing that we care about our children collectively. It's a good thing in our society.
There's a but coming.
Right, but families raise their own children, and there's something unhealthy about people who are extremely eager to raise other people's children, especially against the wishes of those parents. And look, this inclination to raise other people's children is not limited to public education, and it's not limited to a prospect with ESAs. But I just want to point out something important that sometimes people are cautious about the expansion of school choice because they think, well, with government shekels come government shackles, right? So that right now we're scot-free and the state doesn't bother us. But if we start taking public money, then it's just a creep of the regulations we'll have to endure, and they'll take over our idyllic raising of our own children without them touching it. But the truth is that right now, government shackles can come without government shekels, and they do. And the proof of it is the yeshivas in New York. Not to put too fine of a point on shekels. But in New York, with the assistance of the New York Times, the state of New York dictates that private schools must teach a substantially equivalent education, which has been interpreted to mean basically the same curriculum as taught in New York's public schools in the Orthodox Jewish schools in New York, and which is a dramatic imposition on a thriving community that has been successfully raising their children. And they're doing this without giving government assistance. There are no vouchers or ESAs in New York. So you're not protected against government shackles by not taking the shekels. So this fight against the inclination of people to raise other people's children, to raise your children, that is a constant struggle that you're going to have to fight off forever.
I'm not going to disagree with any of that. I'm going to be that guy who just reminds us all that we live in a public policy environment, and it doesn't matter what the arguments are. We have to take accountability seriously, because you said it before. Those with motivated interests, whether from the media to teachers unions, the long knives are out. You're already seeing stories about, look at what these ESA parents are spending money on. Trips to SeaWorld, kayaks, chicken coops. Well, when I was a public school teacher, I took my kids ziplining and to amusement parks, and I visited a school in Tucson the other day that not only had chicken coops, it had a barn and a large animal veterinary science program, and it was fantastic. But my point is, you can make those arguments and still lose. We need to be, what I argued in this piece yesterday, we need to transition from advocates for school choice to sober stewards of public dollars. Why? Because that's what's going to make this sustainable. You're not going to make the opposition go away, but you have to appear at least as concerned about public dollars as everybody else.
I'm going to let you have the last word on that topic, Robert, and pivot us now to the other big sort of issue du jour in education reform, which is the surge of popularity of classical education. And the first question I have for the three of you is just a simple one. Why? It's been around, as Dan Scoggin reminded us all this morning, for millennia, and in its kind of modern incarnation for some time still. But why are we seeing in the present moment this upsurge of interest? I mean, we can chart it simply in the metrics of the attendance of this conference. As Jake Tawney, our colleague this morning, recounted, there's some, we nearly doubled in terms of attendees at the Great Hearts Institute Symposium in the last 2-3 years. So firstly, why? And secondly, is this surge of interest entirely healthy? I think in large part, you'd probably agree it's a very welcome thing, but are there some risks inherent in classical education being enlisted in contemporary culture wars? Lindsey, do you want to go first?
Sure. So, as we were saying earlier, public schools have broken faith with families, and I think they've broken faith with families largely on curriculum issues. And this growth in the classical charter movement, I think, just reflects a desire, a thirst for truth, for rigor. And look, Robert has mentioned this many times in his writings, that schools are not values neutral entities, and it is all a question of whose values they're conveying. And I think parents very much like what they're seeing the classical movement convey within the halls of their schools. And so I think that's the large reason why we're seeing this growth. In terms of the culture war issue, I don't think it's a matter of the classical movement getting dragged into so-called culture wars. I mean, the culture wars are a function of, I think, society, and education's no exception, moving rapidly to the left. Things that we would not have even contemplated 5 years ago are now seen as ostensibly mainstream. I think the classical movement has just stayed the course on the content that they teach. And so if it seems like they've gone to the right or engaged in the culture wars somehow, I think it's just a function of the fact that, not to put it so bluntly, but the other side has gone so far left.
Jay.
So right, the war has come to, the culture war has come to classical schools, not the other way around. There's one,
Finally, some dissent.
But there's always a danger in saying things out loud that are, but I'll go ahead and say something that I think is true. That I think part of the growth in classical education, to some, is that they're crypto-Christian schools. And people hungering for a Christian education have learned that if you say classical instead of Christian, you can get a charter. And I say that, if I say that out loud, it's going to, some charter authorizer somewhere is going to say C. And I say this as a good thing. I want people to, if they want to raise their children as Christian, I want them to be able to. And the fact that they have to say classical instead of Christian is a shame. I'd rather that they can just say what they really mean. But I think that's part of the draw. So I think that's been fueling the movement too. As universal ESAs become more prevalent and religious schools, explicit religious schools, become more available, I think we're going to see more people who are in the classical ed movement go to Christian schools, although they may be Christian schools with an emphasis on a classical curriculum.
At the risk of being a smart aleck, whenever somebody raises this, or laments, oh, the culture wars have come for schools, I can't help but ask, do you know what we do in schools? Have you ever been to a school? Like, a school is a place where we, send our children to learn the best that has been thought and written, or even not the best, what is important enough to know. We make decisions all the time about what's worth knowing and studying, what we praise, what we condemn, what we valorize, etc. We've always been in the culture war business. The difference now is we're fighting over it. But I mean, by definition, schools are cultural cultural institutions and have been for hundreds and hundreds of years. So it's almost naive. To me, at the risk of repeating what I said earlier, this is why you need choice, right? Because of that values-driven nature, because we're going to disagree about, what is the best that's been thought and said and written and whatnot. So since we're not going to resolve that, and probably it's inappropriate to resolve that in a public policy way, you have to let people, make those decisions on their own. By the way, this is not quite your question, Helen, but since I've got the microphone, I'll just say it. One of my concerns about the classical movement, you hear this from Montessori teachers all the time, that there's a lot of schools out there that are Montessori, you know, and I think there's a danger.
We call it classical with a K.
There you go. Yeah. So in other words, you have to be concerned. I mean, I want to see obviously a strong growth of classical education, but I do worry that it's one of the easiest things to do is say, oh, we're a classical school, and we're really not.
Point well taken. At this point, I'd like to invite questions from our audience. If you'd just like to approach the microphone, speak clearly, and try and make it a question, and our panelists will be glad to hold forth.
Real quick, so I work in a state in Alabama where we don't have ESAs. We have tax credit scholarships, which is what I do. Do you all foresee ESA becoming kind of a convergence of all school choice efforts to singularly focus on ESAs to the exclusion of open enrollment or other things? Or where do you see it in the next 25, 50 years of where we are politically in the school choice realm?
So I think in any state right now, I shouldn't say any, but in 90% of the states that are thinking about doing any kind of education choice program, they're looking at ESAs at this point. And, why would you, look, I love a good school voucher, but at this point, why go that route when an ESA does everything a voucher does and all these other things? And on the tax credit side, same thing goes for tax credits. It's really just the funding mechanism that's different. I mean, we have states now, and I think this is a great approach, that are doing tax credit funded education savings accounts. That's great. It just takes a second to explain to people how it works. But I think as a general matter, yes, when states that are thinking about adopting an education choice option, they're moving the ESA route, and I do think that's the direction it's going to go. I mean, in terms of public school choice, great as well. It's kind of the first rung on the ladder of school choice. We'll continue to see that, something that we support. But at the end of the day, I mean, the North Star is universal ESAs.
About this rapid spread in the last few years, is that because politicians fear parent wrath more than policy papers, think tank? Is the parent the big authority here?
I'll take a quick. I'm not as much of a policy expert as my colleagues, but I will tell you a particular lens I have on it. I spent a lot of time over the summer reporting a story that may never end up being written because I think events have overtaken it. For years, what was the big impediment to school choice in red states, where you had the governor, the legislature? Why couldn't you get these things done?
Rural Republicans.
School superintendents were the sand in the gears. Something has changed, Mark. And your guess is as good as mine, but my guess is it is that parent momentum, that they are now willing to stand up to school superintendents who say, "Hey, we're the biggest employer in town. You gotta protect us." I do think we're reaching a tipping point in several of these states. Maybe it's over the culture war issues that Jay described, but something has changed, and I think that's as good an explanation as any.
I just wanted to quick add, though, that I don't think it's either or think tank or parent. It's both. And as I was saying kind of in my opening comments, a few of the ed reform advocacy organizations have recognized this parent groundswell and have capitalized upon it and helped steer it in a productive direction towards universal ESAs. Because look, groups of moms upset about how things are going have a lot of possible solutions, and they don't always know which are going to be the most promising for them. And education reform advocates can be helpful in not only helping mobilize them and steer them towards policymakers in a productive fashion, but also give them concrete policy ideas that might actually solve their problems. While I think the effort of running for school board and trying to take over school boards is laudable, I think politically that's really hard to sustain. Universal ESAs solves that problem more efficiently. I think the fact that we're offering universal ESAs as a solution to those groups of moms has been key. I should emphasize, though, the majority of education reform advocacy organizations and think tanks continue to oppose this approach. And so if you out there in the audience or on the online viewing audience, if you're a donor to a education reform organization, pick carefully. because a lot of them are rowing in the other direction and are working against parents right now. Even though they're education reform organizations, they are bad, and they need to stop getting your money.
Look, every time you invoke Corey DeAngelis' name, an angel gets its wings. But I will say that Corey,
I knew he was going to come up.
I mean, he really deserves, and Jay mentioned it earlier, but he really deserves so much credit for this. For decades, we were all overly polite, I think, and how we pushed back on opponents of school choice. And Corey said he wasn't going to be polite anymore, and people told him to be polite, and he just kept going. And he said, look, Mr. Legislator, you oppose school choice. You send your own children to private schools. You yourself went to a private school. And he has done this over and over again, called them out on the hypocrisy, and turned education choice into a litmus test. And Jason wrote about this recently, too. You really should be on this panel, Jason. But Kim Reynolds in Iowa, she supported primary opponents within her own party among those people who opposed the school choice effort in that state. And she turned the tables in Iowa, and Iowa now has a universal ESA program. So I think people are they're getting bold about it, and between both parents and policy have really turned it into that political litmus test.
Yeah, Corey and Jason, the soccer mums champions.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
A question from the floor, and then I will throw one in from our live stream audience.
Thank you all. So I'm Jamie Buckland from West Virginia. So I actually have an organization, the West Virginia FEW, Families United for Education. We exist to remove barriers, guide parents, and support providers through the transformation of K-12 education in the Mountain State. My question is, research does show that there is not necessarily a huge adoption of these programs early on, and there's misinformation, and parents do need guidance and support on that. And on the supply side, new educational entrepreneurs need guidance and support, and that's the work that we've been doing on the ground in West Virginia for years. So whose responsibility is it to fund that? Should it be a philanthropic effort, or is there some other way? Because we do not have sustainable funding in our work, and it's really hard to plan and set forth action initiatives to really meet the demand. So that's the question. Where should we be looking to make it sustainable?
Yeah, and you're right. Look, I mean, if you look here in Arizona, the growth in the ESA program, the longest running ESA program I mentioned earlier, there are 1.1 million students in public schools and public charter schools, about 50,000 now, which is phenomenal. But in the ESA program here, and that's taken about 13 years or so. So you do need some sort of entity that can do that type of outreach. I think on this particular instance, Florida got it right, where they said, we are going to house management of the ESA program with nonprofits, and that has enabled these nonprofits whose sole job is to support the ESA option or school choice options generally, promote it to families, send information out in Spanish, whatever they need to do. So I think that was a really good move on the part of Florida, was to house that management with a nonprofit, because otherwise you put it with a state agency, not only are you open to government shenanigans that could unfold, but it's not their day-to-day job. They've got the 1.1 million kids in the district system to think about as well and to manage. So I think that's an important component of it.
Right. In I think the current draft of the Florida Universal ESA, there's a choice navigator requirement. So it would be publicly funded consultant to help steer parents towards quality choices. This is a very bad idea. I'm against it. And while I think it is essential that that families get help in navigating all these choices, I really don't think it should be publicly required or publicly funded. Because if it is, it's going to be, the movie Viva Zapata, where you throw out the dictator and then you become the dictator. This could be very unhealthy.
Which is different, though, than saying house management of your ESA in a nonprofit, not in a state agency.
Nonprofit is different. Although even those nonprofits in Florida are funded with a VIG off of public funding, or off of the scholarship funding, which is not great. And I don't think that's so. Yes. People should get help, but that if that help is publicly funded or publicly mandated, it will grow into being a new authority to raise other people's kids.
Robert, I want to give you first crack at this question from our live stream audience. There's been a lot of talk about ESAs, but where do charter schools fit into the future of education reform? They are facing increased regulation and being molded into district schools by another name.
It's a great question. Why wouldn't, if you're a charter school, I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to pose it anyway. If you're a charter school, why would you not just say, hey, I'm going to be a private school now because I can
lose money.
Well, that's why. That's exactly right. Now, that said, could I squint and see a scenario under which, because you have greater control as a private school, that you can enroll more kids and make up the difference and increase class sizes and whatnot? Yeah, probably. So I don't think. I'm not quite ready to accept that answer. Well, of course I'm going to stay at charter school because I get a higher per pupil. That's true, but I think that's that could be creatively managed. So I think you may start to see charter schools just say, you know what, it's easier for some of the reasons you said, Jay. You know, the what was your analogy? Shekels and shackles. I like that. That it's just easier, and I can be more successful. I can get better outcomes for kids. As a private school. I mean, frankly, one of the dirty little secrets I think about charter schools over the years is, given their relative advantages, can I say this? They're just not as good as they should be. You know, given the structural advantages they have, we should expect a lot more of them. And frankly, I think for a private school, the bar is even a little bit higher. You have a lot more control. So I'm hoping that educators, I alluded to this before, my hope for ESAs and choice in general is that it will start to spur a robust private market that really expects a lot of itself. You know, there's a reason that the wealthiest parents in this country spend an extraordinary amount of money for private schools. I'm not saying they get their money's worth; they probably do not. But there's an expectation that I will pay a premium price and get a premium product. That's not necessarily where we should be going with ESAs. But I've said this a lot of times recently, Helen. If I were half my age right now, I'd be moving to Arizona and opening a private school.
I bet Jay has thoughts on charter school. No.
Oh, unfortunately the movement's dying. I mean, let's be candid about this. There's really almost no growth nationwide in the number of charter schools, but the movement is dying. It's largely a self-inflicted wound. The national leadership of the charter school movement has been very bad, and they went all in on the portfolio management model, where they were going to be the good, smart people to replace the dumb, bad people, and they were gonna curate the right set of options for people, and it's led to underwhelming results and such quality control that no one's good enough, so no charters open. This is a very bad arrangement. It's also politically disastrous.
With Arizona being the heroic
yes, Arizona. I always have to put an asterisk. Things are great in the charter sector in Arizona, but nationwide, I think we have to be eyes open that the charter movement looks like it's dying.
Thank you all. This has been great. Quick question. When we're thinking about sort of the macro trends in American politics and where our different coalitions are lining up, you know, I'm hearing some things from our friends who might be more on the right. Things like, you know, choice is great, but it's only on the margins, you know. Private institutions can't stem this tide of cultural rot. We have to do something top down. We have to sort of impose our will on the public education system at large. I suspect this voice will continue to grow. I'd like to hear this panel's response to that. Thank you.
Can I go first on that? Because I'm kind of obsessed by this topic. I'm a choice guy. Did I mention I'm a choice guy? Because I'm a choice guy. Okay, my turn. Now there's a but coming. We can't give up on the public education system, folks. That's where the kids are, where almost all the kids are, like 80, 90%. That's not going to change in 25 years. It'll get lower, but I don't think it's going to go away in my lifetime, certainly. So I worry about disengaging, Aaron, with the public school system and saying, you know, the same arguments that we have been making for the last hour here would lead sensible people to say, well, I'm taking my kids out. Well, then, if you're concerned about the values of those who are teaching in the public school system and all the people with different values leave, well, then you're turning over the education of the vast majority of American children to people whose values are anathema to you. That's a strange thing to do. So we can't do that. Now, having said that, something else I've nattered on about ad nauseum in the last couple of years is how public education has just taken liberties that are untoward for a government. So I was a teacher, a public school teacher in New York City. And what was I told as a public school teacher? Mr. Pondiscio, you need to be an agent of change. You need to teach for social justice. This was a condition of my getting my master's degree. Nobody said to me what in retrospect seems like the most important thing I should have heard, if not on day one as a teacher, maybe on week one. Pondiscio, you're a public employee. You're a government actor. You're a state agent with enormous influence over an audience of a captive audience of other people's children. You need to be humble. Okay, so I think there's a lot of work for us to do to just, and again, this is not teacher bashing, but just to kind of get public education back to first purposes and frankly, stay in its lane. It's interesting that in states where governors are active and activist on this, one of the first things that they hear is, you need to stay in your lane. Well, that is their lane. It's literally what a state does, is decide, what public schools do, what they teach, what they must not teach, et cetera. So you might not like the decisions they make, but we have a remedy for that, and it's called elections, right? So there's a lot of work to be done to kind of just rethink our social contract, as it were, with public education. But the answer is not, let's just give up on them.
So a couple of years ago, Jonathan Butcher and I contracted with Robert to write an essay in something called The Not So Great Society, a little old edited volume that we put out. And, I knew...
And she regrets it.
And I knew I was going to have a headache when I got it. And you had a line in there about, we cannot concede the content that is taught in public schools to the left. You said it more eloquently than that. But, it was tough for a minute there, but the more I read it, Robert has convinced me over the years. And I think just beyond that, it is, look, these are, as you said, state actors, right? These are public institutions with teachers who receive publicly funded salaries. Everything about it from top to bottom is taxpayer funded. So I think you're right. We cannot be shy about engaging in what these public institutions are teaching the millions of children that are sitting in their classrooms. And how we go about it, there's a lot of debate in great states like Florida about what that looks like. But I think at the end of the day, it is largely a transparency agenda. We've done a lot of work. Jonathan Butcher, my colleague at Heritage, has done a lot of work on going as far as drafting model legislation about what that looks like, that parents should not have to drive to the district headquarters in order to see the content that's taught in their kids' local public schools. So having radical academic transparency. Jay's been doing a lot of work on something that was an idea of Max Eden's recently called the Given Name Act. And Jonathan also wrote model legislation for that, where a school cannot change your child's name, can't call your child by something other than as what is on their birth certificate, absent written parental consent, because we know that changing names is often that first step in that social transition process that could ultimately lead to irreversible surgical transition. So transparency around items like that. And then, of course, choice, school choice is the teeth that has to go with all of those things. I mean, you can have all the transparency in the world around what your child's schools are teaching, but if you can't do anything about it, you're really in a tough spot. There's the critical race theory side of it. I would say critical theory broadly, right, is the kind of direction that people need to be thinking now. Critical gender ideology falls under that critical theory umbrella. And I think here too, Jonathan's done a really good job of articulating it is the application of critical race theory that's the problem, not necessarily the content per se. But if you are sorting children by race into affinity groups, you're violating the Civil Rights Act. So I think it is a matter of being very clear about exactly what state legislators can do to make sure that the content that's being taught in public schools is appropriate and reflects parental preferences, but we do need to engage.
Can I just make one brief point on curriculum transparency, because I'm kind of a curriculum fetishist. I'm a curriculum transparency fan, but if you think that knowing the curriculum, it gives you a lens into what's happening in your child's school, you are mistaken. We know this from data, like literally 98% of teachers in this country adapt, curate, create from scratch, etc. Their materials and lesson plans. If anything, in fact, I can see this working against those who are concerned about the content. Like what you think, oh, I know the child's curriculum, now I can go home, problem solved. No, that is just not the way this works. So
Teacher trainings, you know, if you're
it's
paying Ibram Kendi for a
it's a
lecture.
lot more complicated
should know
than,
that as
oh,
a
what's the
parent.
curriculum that's been adopted? I mean, I've said this before, but I mean, knowing the curriculum that is officially adopted by your child's school tells you less about what's happening in school than reading a menu online will tell you about a restaurant.
So I don't want to, I see there's a line for questions, and I don't want to delay your questions too much longer, but I just wanted to get in one other point about the need to attend to traditional public schools, even as we expand universal ESAs. It's entirely true the vast majority of children will remain in traditional public schools for the foreseeable future, so we cannot neglect that. But we have to remember what has gone wrong, I think, with those traditional publics, what has actually created momentum for choice, and what could be restored to traditional publics, which is essentially decentralized community control. So public schools used to be authentic extensions of communities. And while universal ESAs is it makes schooling an extension of the family, public schooling is a natural extension of the community. But we've deprived communities of control over their own schools. We did this in a variety of ways over the several decades. We consolidated from 100,000 school districts to a little more than 10,000. We created state departments of education that became more muscular. We created a U.S. Department of Education that became more muscular. We can reverse all those processes and restore community control over their own schools, and that will go a long way towards strengthening our traditional public schools. I mean, look, people have a hard time imagining that anything is possible to change if it's been around for 10 years. If it's been around for 10 years, people think that it has always been so. So, like, most people don't know, did you know that states didn't have standards before the 1980s?
They have them now?
They do, right? But it was possible to have public schools without a state Department of Education articulating state standards.
No, we didn't have a Department of Ed before
I know.
1980, Mike.
So, like, you can function without these things, and I think we're going to have to start unraveling it to restore community control.
Question from the floor.
This might be way too big of a question, but I really want to hear what you have to say about it. So we've mentioned the culture wars, we've mentioned school choice growing primarily in red states. The myth of the bipartisan ed reform in Milwaukee was mentioned. How do we make school choice truly bipartisan? What can we do to advance that?
So Corey has the
Here's
answer.
the pitch.
Corey has the answer. The way to bipartisan school choice is through monopartisan school choice. Hyperpartisan. So it's actually the same process by which women earn the right to vote. Okay? Which is that the reforms adopted in certain places for reasons that are particular to those places, and then it's leveraged to other places as part of a competitive pressure. So let's just quick lesson on how women got the right to vote. There were Western states that were really short on women. They wanted more women to move out to them. And so they thought, well, what can we do to make it attractive for women to move here? And they thought, well, what if we were to offer them the right to vote, the right to own property in their own name, the right to inherit, right? If they gave them more rights, it would be more appealing to move to Western states that were short on women. And so the early states to give women the right to vote were, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and eventually it got to enough of those states that they could log roll bargain with other states. In addition, those other states were worried about losing women, and so they began to adopt too, and it expanded eventually universally. So the parallel here is, if we can adopt universal ESAs in a dozen red states this year, okay, and then maybe a dozen more red states, because there are 30-some red states right now, and people start moving from New York to Florida and Texas and Arizona, California to Arizona and Texas. It will place competitive pressure on California and New York to do the same. And they'll eventually get there because, right now they're bleeding population, and it'll get worse as other states are offering something very attractive to young families. And then it'll become a bipartisan issue.
This is what I like to joke is the when Harry met Sally Ed Reform plan, that good things happen and people look at it and say, I'll have what she's having. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. In other words, bipartisanship is lovely, but if it's not necessary to get where you want to go, I learned this lesson from Professor Greene, then why worry about it?
Well, we will get there. We will get there. I mean, they'll just be, blue states will just be late adopters, but they will be adopters, and they'll do it for competitive reasons. Just like states that have super high, marginal tax rates, discover, they lose businesses, they're losing revenue, they've got to lower their marginal tax rate, and so they'll do it out of competitive pressure.
Thank you very much. I'm Ryan Hanning with the San Juan Diego Institute, and this panel has been really illuminative for me. Quick question. So we've been living this for the last 2 weeks in Arizona, or last 2 months rather in Arizona, having successfully bid for a grant that provided an opportunity to promote ESA and also sort of build quality around it and target the right student body. I'm curious if you'd speak to innovation education, particularly related to ESA. We received the grant and also lost the grant. It was canceled by our new governor. So I'm curious about that argument about expanding opportunities for innovation education based off being able to provide opportunities through ESA.
Yeah, I mean, this is, I think, the big feature, right, of an ESA is that there are so many potential innovations that are out there that we haven't even conceived of yet. And when I mentioned earlier the data on the number of families who are customizing, I do think this is where the innovation comes from, is, you've got families who are doing, equine therapy, or, that's the example that's always used in Arizona, or, so many, I remember years ago when Arizona had first started with the ESA program, thinking through, how do we create a system where you can maximize the options that are available, the innovation that's out there. And what Arizona ultimately said was, well, we want families to drive those options by effectively whitelisting what's available to them. If you are a family, I remember there's a family whose child needed a therapeutic trike, and there was a big discussion online and a big discussion with the Arizona Department of Ed about whether or not that could be an allowable use of an ESA. And ultimately, they granted that use of the ESA, and now that's something that was added to the list of eligible expenditures. That's something that, if you just had a state agency from day one saying these are the 7 things that you can use your ESA for, never would have happened. And so I think the more that we're able to allow families and individual small providers to drive what's available in the market, the more we're going to see in terms of innovation. But yeah, I mean, it's going to be, I think, incredibly exciting to look around the corner and see how families are ultimately using their ESAs here, and things that we have not thought about being, allowable uses. Hopefully, we'll see some pretty exciting stuff down the road. But I don't know.
Quick follow-up. Robert, you mentioned microschools. Could you just talk a little bit about where those are working well and what particular innovation is happening in microschools?
So I didn't hear the question.
You mentioned microschools.
Yes, where are they working
Yeah,
well?
where are they working well, and what particular innovations might be features of some of the microschools? We've seen some here in Arizona. I'm curious what's going on nationwide.
Yeah, it's I'm guardedly optimistic about them because I think it does, as I said before, it kind of demystifies the teaching profession. It really pushes accountability down to the level of mom and dad. And they're just nice environments, right? You've got kids with 6 or 8 friends around a kitchen table. It's lovely. But I could also I'm a little bit worried about the overuse of them. In other words, and this is complicated. I mean, the structure is that the microschool is not really the teacher. It's a distant charter school, etc. I'm tempted to make an analogy with Uber. And I was talking to one microschool proponent who said, well, like if you don't like your guide, you can pick a different guide. Just like but I'm not sure that's persuasive because that implies that there's going to be other microschools accessible and nearby. So it's a lot of times these things are just not as easy as we think. There could be some just bad outcomes that are associated with them. One problem that I think is being solved, which I was heartened, I had dinner with a woman, and I'm blanking on the name of her organization, who is organizing black moms in Phoenix to run microschools. So that's solving the problem I discussed earlier. And it's an economic driver in those communities where now I can derive an income, by being a microschool guide. So, again, I think we're just in the infancy here of this, but it's an intriguing model. Because I think, because I tend to think that people could be civilians, as it were, could be decent teachers. There's no magic, as you said, Ed, Jay. I've been to ed school, so trust me, I know there's no magic that is given to you when you go through that makes you more effective with kids. I'm really, really intrigued to see where it goes.
Also, too, I would add, 15 years ago, Clayton Christensen was doing all of his really great work on disruptive innovation. And, he would always talk about wealthy people get the worst version of a product because they're the early adopters, right? They've got the money, they go out and get the brand new iPhone, even if it's not the best version ultimately. I think what we're going to see across the states is just a real refinement. Arizona, and again, I'll say it until I'm blue in the face, did a phenomenal job right out of the gate with how they designed the program and created an environment for innovation to flourish. But I think we are going to see some really important refinements in other states as more and more adopters engage in the ESA option.
This is a quick one. For those of us that can't move to Arizona and start a private school, how do you practically recommend pursuing ESAs in our own state?
How do you pursue them? You mean you wanted to
Had
adopt
someone
it as
recommend
law?
take out a Washington Post ad with 50 other moms in the community of all diverse backgrounds. That's going to help. Is that going to help?
Wait a
What
minute.
would help?
I'm thinking out loud here, so maybe I'm missing something, but the same funding mechanism that allows Prenda to operate in Arizona, why wouldn't that exist in other states? In other words, they predate the ESAs. By partnering with an online charter school and passing through the per pupil.
A lot of states restrict online charter schools.
Okay, but I'll bet there are some states, but I'll bet there are some states right now that could actually do this in the absence of an ESA, because Prenda was doing it in the absence of a universal ESA.
Yeah, virtual charter is essentially the end run in a number of places. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Are you saying how to launch a school in a state, or how to get an ESA?
I think we know how to launch the school. It's funding the school. So if you've got a school idea but you don't have public funding, what can you be doing the next 1 to 3 years to lay the landscape that you could get public funding?
I think it's that. I think it's looking to see if you can create. It would have to probably be a micro school, and obviously looking at the regulations, they differ from state to state on homeschooling and whatnot. But I'm sure there are more states than we're thinking about or are cognizant of that you could do what Prenda has done and set up a perfectly legal micro school on public dollars by partnering with an online charter in probably a lot more states than we think.
I think maybe as many as 40. Yeah, which may not help our particular questioner, but you're right. There are certainly many more ways to skin this cat.
Might not have to move as far as Arizona.
Very good. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think we'll end it there. I'm sure there are many more questions in the room, and I think our speakers are with us for a little while yet today and would be happy to answer them one-to-one if you would like to find them at the break. But please join me in thanking our fantastic panelists. It's been a marvelous discussion. Lindsey, Burke, Jay Greene, Robert Pondiscio.